Dufu, the Ancient Cypress. In front of Gongming Temple stands an ancient cypress. Its boughs are like bronze, its roots hard as stone. Its age-hoard, rain-washed bark circles a trunk 40 spans thick. Its jet black branches meet the sky 2,000 feet up. The ruler and his minister have lived out their time, but this tree is still cherished by people of today. When clouds come, they join it to mists rising from Long Wu Gorge. At moonrise, it feels the same chill as the snow-covered mountains. I recall where the road winds east around my brocade pavilion, past the temple shared by Liu Bei and his martial marquis. There too were cypresses whose branches lofted high above the ancient plain and hung over the secluded temple, its faded paint and staring windows. But this tree, with its python roots, manages to hold itself upright, despite the battering winds and the high, lonely depths of the sky. Only the power of a divine spirit could hold it so tall and straight. Its lofty height makes manifest the Creator's own hand. If a great hall had collapsed and needed rafters and beams, the thousands of ox teams would balk, turning to stare at the mountainous weight. Even without the carving of craftsmen, it is already a wonder of the world. It has never resisted the axe. There is simply no way to haul it off. The bitter heart may be unable to resist the ravaging termites, but still its aromatic leaves sustain the roosting phoenix. Men of ambition, you who labor unnoticed, don't sigh with resentment. From of old, towering timber has been hard to make use of. So we have another poem by Dufu, and I can see a lot of connections with the one we read yesterday, sent to Grand Master of Remonstrance Hanju. So what is the topic of this poem? So the topic of this poem is the call, the appreciation for those worthy, ambitious, smart men that the state needs and that might not be recognized, they might not be appreciated by their rulers or by their times. So this is a very general topic that Du Fu and many Chinese poets develop in other pieces that we've encountered here. That is to say, merit unrewarded, the virtuous, the meritorious, the wise official who is not employed by his ruler. The form it takes in this poem is through veilly thinned allegory. So the poem seems to be describing an ancient cypress, as the title says, a majestic tree, but this tree is very conveniently located in front of the Gongming Temple. Now, the Gongming Temple was dedicated to the memory of Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang was an almost mythological general from the Three Kingdoms period, that is around the beginning of the 3rd century of our era, and he was a wonderful military strategist, a general, a wise minister, and it was thanks to him that his ruler, Liu Bei, managed to carve out a little kingdom for himself in the west, the kingdom of Shu. So this tree in the Gongming Temple, which was dedicated to the memory of Zhuge Liang, was allegedly planted by the general himself. When Du Fu is contemplating it, half a millennia has passed since the events of the Three Kingdoms period. Evidently, Zhuge Liang and, by metonymy, this tree, this ancient cypress, represent this general and all the wise and smart men that should be employed by the government, especially in Du Fun's own time, after the Al Lushan rebellion and after the conflicts. We may assume that in a very indirect way, Du Fu is also pointing towards himself as one of those meritorious people that appear at the conclusion of the poem, or that are referenced directly at the conclusion of the poem. Yeah? Men of ambition, you who labor unnoticed. So that's the major theme of the poem, therefore. Merit, the virtue of virtuous man in the past, more specifically Zhuge Liang, and the need for such men in the present. But of course it has some sub-themes related to this main theme. So it seems to be, or it appears to be, a landscape poem, because it describes this massive tree in its temple, and it also describes another temple dedicated also to Zhuge Liang in Shu, in the area of Sichuan, where Du Fu lived for a few years. So landscape poem. And I think those are the main two topics, you could say. There's a landscape descriptive element, historical element, acknowledging, recognizing the past and the great heroes from the past. But the difficulty of wise, smart, able people to be employed. But basically, the main theme, as we said, is recognition of the great man and the need for great men to serve in office. Now, I wouldn't say this poem has any clear breaks. It's difficult to, I found it very difficult to carve it into pieces or into different sections. So I'll just start couplet by couplet, and I might comment on subsections there. In front of Gongming Temple stands an ancient cypress. Its boughs are like bronze, its roots hard as stone. So the poem starts by visually painting for us this majestic tree that is in the Gongming Temple, that, as I've just said, was a temple. It has been destroyed now because of modern engineering in the Upper Jiangzi area. But it was a temple dedicated to Zhuge Liang, probably at the site where he was killed or nearby. And here in front of this temple we have this tree, a majestic cypress that doesn't seem to be made of wood. It looks hard, so the boughs are like bronze and the roots are like stone. The poem will continue explaining and describing in the next couplet the aspect of the tree. Its age-hoard, rain-washed bark circles a trunk 40 spans thick. Its jet black branches meet the sky 2,000 feet up. So not only is it hard like stone and bronze, but it's tall, it's a high tree, and it's also a very wide one. Yeah, we get 40 spans thick, 2,000 feet up. So, a really, really majestic axis mundi almost. A lance piercing the skies. So these first two couplets describe the tree, the following ones connected with its history, yeah, and with the figure or figures it's connected to. The ruler and his minister have lived out their time, but this tree is still cherished by people of today. As we said, the Three Kingdoms period took place at the end of the Han Dynasty, around the year 200 until 250, 280. And Du Fu is writing in probably around 760, 770. So he is writing 500 years after the events he is depicting. Evidently, the king Liu Bei of Shuhan and Zhuge Liang have long since died and passed away, but the tree is still there. There is this connection with the past through the temple, but especially through the tree. And this connection, this physical connection, is also a connection of memory. The memory of the great deeds and of the great men of the past has not gone away. So, next couplet. When clouds come, they join it to mists rising from Long Wu Gorge. At moonrise, it feels the same chill as the snow-covered mountains. So Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang were the people in charge of a state in the west of China, in what had been the ancient territory of Shu. But their territory expanded during the wars, and they controlled some lands a bit to the east of this region, and that was where this cypress and this Gongming temple lay. But this tree is so tall that from it a connection can be made with the lands of Shu to its west. basically to the Wu Gorge, which was there, and the snow-covered mountains there. So when the clouds come, those clouds touch the top of this cypress tree, and they join all the way for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to the mists of Longwu Gorge in Sichuan. And also when the moon is bright, when the moon is rising, the coldness that is felt here next to this majestic tree is the same as the coldness in the snow-covered mountains of Shu, which would be, as I said, some hundreds, if not thousands of miles from where this temple and tree are located. And this traveling back to Shu allows, in the next couple of couplets, for Du Fu to reminisce his own stay in the area of Shu, in its capital Chengdu, where he lived in a small hut, which he called Brocade Hut, in the years after the Anlushan rebellion. He sought and got some refuge in a bit of a bucolic life in that region for a few years. I recall where the road winds east, around my brocade pavilion, past the temple shared by Liu Bei and his martial Marquis. There too were cypresses whose branches lofted high above the ancient plain, and hung over the secluded temple, its faded paint and staring windows. So, as I said, Du Fu, looking at this majestic cypress tree and at the Gongming Temple, remembers another temple next to his hut in Sichuan, a temple also dedicated to Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang, who was known after death as the martial Marquis. This temple, in fact, still stands today. It can be visited. So if you ever go to Chengdu, to China, visit the temple. The images describe the temple in a bit of a dilapidated condition, it seems. Yeah, the temple is secluded with faded paint and staring windows. So the temple in Sichuan probably was semi-abandoned, or at least in a very wild and natural area. But it's also surrounded by cypresses, like the Gongmin Temple. All of them high, but none of them as high as this one. But this tree, with its python roots, manages to hold itself upright, despite the battering winds in the high, lonely depths of the sky. So yes, there are other trees and there are other temples, but this one, which is the true incarnation of the soul and of the spirit of Zhuge Liang, this one stands higher than the rest, more majestic, resisting the attacks of nature, the battering winds. And not only nature, the next couplets will show us that it's not only nature who cannot defeat the power of this tree. Humans wouldn't be able to if they tried either. It says, only the power of a divine spirit could hold it so tall and straight. Its lofty height makes manifest the Creator's own hand. If a great hall had collapsed and needed rafters and beams, the thousands of ox teams would balk, turning to stare at the mountainous weight. So this tree is so massive that if wood were needed, because a palace or a massive hall had collapsed, and big trees had to be chopped down for construction wood, the teams which were to take the wood away from this tree wouldn't dare to do it. It's just too big. It's impossible to carry such a massive tree, such a massive weight. Even without the carving of craftsmen, it is already a wonder of the world. It has never resisted the axe. There is simply no way to haul it off. So the tree is so massive, so impressive, it's impossible to cut, and it's a beauty. Now, in a lot of Chinese traditional texts, there are injunctions, especially in Taoist texts, against being too good, against being too brilliant. And the metaphor that is used is usually that of the beautiful tree. And then the Chuang-Tzu says something like, it's only the bent, gnarled, ugly tree that can live out its days till to its fullest. The beautiful, straight-growing tree is chopped down for wood. So that the message there would be, don't try to be too successful or too able in the service of society, because you will suffer the ups and downs of inconstant fortune when serving rulers. But this is an exceptional case. Du Fu seems to be saying that a person of absolute ability and virtue should not pay heed to this Taoistic injunction. He is a glorious tree, too glorious, too big, too noble to be cut down. The bitter heart may be unable to resist the ravaging termites, but still its aromatic leaves sustain the roosting phoenix. So Du Fu is also aware that nothing is eternal, not even the glory and the reputation of the greatest of Chinese generals and strategians. In fact, Zhuge Liang was deified after death as a god of war. But he recognizes, whether he's speaking of the tree or of Zhuge Liang's reputation, that, the tree might start to be, rotting at the core, because termites are gnawing at it. But anyway, time passes for everything. But still, even after 500 years, and even after suffering the ravages of the heart, its aromatic leaves sustain the roosting phoenix. We can imagine, apart from the possibility of the tree being so tall that it is imagined that the phoenixes can roost on top of it, phoenixes are, the bird of inspiration. So Du Fu might be pointing here that even now, after all these years, even if the tree is rotting, or will fall down, it still manages to inspire people like him, birds, singing birds, poets, to sing about its virtues and its beauty. Finally, the couplet that concludes the poem. Men of ambition, you who labor unnoticed, don't sigh with resentment. From of old, towering timber has been hard to make use of. So the message seems to be a self-consolating message in a way. So Du Fu is basically saying, if you are ambitious and you are not recognized, don't worry. It has been difficult from ancient times to now for merit to be recognized. And he has been connecting this tree with the image of a figure of the past who was merit incarnate, but very, very ingeniously in the last lines in which he was weaving the theme of the impossibility of chopping down this tree and therefore of using its wood for firewood or for construction. He is connecting with another element related to virtuous men not being employed. Just as the wood of this massive tree cannot be employed for buildings and constructions, so the men of ambition who labor without being noticed by the emperor or his courtiers, so they work without being cut and taken to court, without being recognized. Timber, a note to this poem, states at the back of this book, is a word that has the same pronunciation and the same origin as merit. So you could read this as, from of old, towering merit has been hard to make use of. It has been difficult for rulers to employ the best people, and also it has been difficult for rulers to make use of big pieces of wood like this. So quite a nice poem. I think it touches very deeply to many of Du Fu's obsessions. That is his Confucian obligation or self-felt obligation of the necessity of serving the state, his frustration at not being employed by the court, his feeling that in these hard times that he lived in at the time when the empire was about to collapse from rebels, men of worth, men of merit, like the age-old heroic figure of Zhuge Liang were necessary and were probably not, in his opinion, being employed by the emperor. So quite a great poem and quite a great image.